Hey there, Andrew here, welcoming you to another episode of Research and Reviews. This is the fifth and final episode of the Airgun Novice series, and in this episode, I'm going to be telling you the good, the bad, and the ugly of all of the items that I purchased to begin my air gunning career. So check it out. I purchased an Omega Trail Charger air compressor, an air tank, an AEA HPSS, and a Hatsan Blitz, both of those in .30 caliber. So let's start with the Omega air compressor and the Hatsan Blitz. The compressor was well packaged, it was sturdily built, and it came with a comprehensive toolkit and was in perfect working order. It did not, however, come with helpful documentation. What little documentation it did come with had more to do with a parts list and gaskets and rebuild processes and virtually nothing dealing with the actual operation of the compressor itself. I had to get all of the basic information like what the duty cycle was and things like that off of YouTube videos. The documentation was also curiously unbranded, which kind of gives me the impression that maybe these compressors are built by a single manufacturer and marketed under a variety of brand names. Now, the outer packaging for the Hatsan was well done by Midway, the supplier, but the actual packaging for the product really lacked. The rifle itself was only protected by a couple of strips of foam. The box was very thin cardboard. For an item that ran about $1,000, I was a bit disappointed with the packaging. Thankfully, all of the contents were accounted for and undamaged. My first experience with the Omega was charging the Hatsan, and the Hatsan's manual, by the way, was pretty minimal as well, and so I felt like I was flying a bit by braille in this process. Now, there was a fill probe with the rifle that was not compatible with the quick disconnect on the compressor hose. I'd learned from previous research that the Hatsan fill probe was proprietary, so I just removed the QD connector and I affixed the probe directly to the hose. Then I connected the hose to the rifle, fired up the compressor, and started the fill-up process. Unfortunately, I had no idea what normal looked or sounded like. I could hear a repeated hissing sound, and I had no idea whether that was leaking air or if that was the sound of the air going into the rifle's tank. After about 10 minutes, though, I realized that the needle wasn't moving on the gauge of the rifle, and so I shut everything down to investigate and see what was up. When I pulled the probe, I noticed that there were indents on the probe that were about the same size as some seals that came with the rifle. Now, of course, the manual gave me no idea on what the seals were for or if the seals were supposed to be placed on the fill probe. Since the fit looked fairly close, I decided to install them onto the probe and reconnected everything and began the air up process again. I reconnected everything, fired up the compressor, and could still hear a little bit of a hissing sound, but it was far diminished from what it was. So I shut everything down again and experimented a little further. I removed the fill probe and decided to put a little plumber's tape on the threads and then reconnected. I fired everything back up and voila, no hissing air. The needle on the Hatsan began to rise, and before too long I was filled up to 250 bar. I dry fired the Hatsan in both semi-auto and full auto modes. Everything seemed to cycle perfectly. I shot one round out in my backyard just to make sure that everything functioned as far as feeding and such, and then I let the rifle set overnight. When I picked it up the next morning, I checked the gauge just to make sure I was still at 250 bar. I was, and so I was satisfied I didn't have any unwanted leaks. A week or so later, I was able to actually take the Hatsan out to a safe area where I was able to do full function test, testing all the magazines, firing in semi and full auto, and the rifle operated perfectly, exactly as advertised. Moving on to the AEA HPSS, the packaging was far more robust and the manual was much more informative, though it still lacked in some areas. For example, there was absolutely no information on how to adjust the power wheel. What's up with that? Fit and finish with the AEA were great, and the initial air up went without a hitch. I did, though, have a few issues. First, the folding stock wasn't locking up properly. I talked to Terry Fox at Fox Air Power, and he gave me a few suggestions, but I ultimately applied my own creative solution, and if you'd like to know what that was, I can make another video on that. Just let me know. Second was an issue with feeding reliability. All of my magazines had some level of jamming occurring, and some more so than others. The ultimate fix for that was replacing them all with the new upgraded magazines. Since that time, I've had no more feeding issues. Finally, there was an issue with the trigger. After only 2.5 mags were fired through, the trigger just stopped working. It was as if it had been disconnected internally. I talked to a variety of sources to see what I could do to resolve this issue, and most of them suggested some level of disassembly of the rifle and proceeding from there. Not wanting to do that, I started manipulating the trigger, just flicking it back and forth several times rapidly. And then at some point, there was like an internal ka-chunk, and the trigger was back. I've never had any problems since. My guess is that a burr or some type of debris got jammed up into the works and was preventing the trigger from actuating. Now, you might think that with the issues I was having, I would be no fan of AEA, but that's not true. As a matter of fact, I enjoy the HPSS way more than I do the Hatsan. The Hatsan is long and it's heavy and it's cumbersome, but the AEA is short and it's compact and it's just fun to shoot, despite the early issues that I had. Now, finally, I want to talk about the tank that I purchased from Pyramid Air. Now, doing top-offs is possible with the Omega, but it takes a little time and it's a little noisy too. But my 88 cubic foot tank is amazing. It'll top off in seconds, it's quiet, and I just have to tell you, if your budget can tolerate a tank and a compressor to charge it with, that's the way to go. Now, filling a tank of that size from zero did take a while with the Omega. It was a couple of hours over a couple of days. But topping off the tank, I can do that in maybe a half an hour. No big deal. So, given my experience, what would I have done differently and what would I do the same? Well, first of all, I may not have bought the Hatsan. Like I said, it's big, it's long, it's bulky, it's heavy, and it's just not fun to go out and shoot with unless you're using the full auto, and I rarely use that. Second, I would make sure that I did a lot of research on the basics of how to operate my equipment. You can't depend on manuals to help you out there. Third, I would always recommend purchasing a tank and a compressor to charge it with if your budget can in any way tolerate that. And fourth, given the issues I had early on with my AEA, would I purchase one again? The answer is absolutely yes, and this is why. It's small, it's light, and it's fun. And the support I've gotten from Terry Fox and Bintac has been nothing short of amazing. So despite those early issues that I had, I am an AEA fan. As a matter of fact, I've just pre-ordered a Challenger Pro. And if you'd like a review on that, just let me know and I'll work up a video on that as well. So that's my experience as an airgun novice. I'll see you next time.